Hello, fellow travelers through time. Before we begin our journey into one of history's most challenging periods, I want you to settle in comfortably. Whether it's morning where you are, afternoon, or the deep of night, you've chosen to spend the next 2 hours walking alongside women who lived centuries before us. Women whose voices have been largely silenced by history. Tonight, we're not just learning about the past, we're bearing witness to lives that were simultaneously constrained and courageous, oppressed and resilient. This is the story of medieval European women from roughly the 5th to the 15th centuries, 1,000 years of human experience that shaped everything we know about gender, family, and survival. Imagine, if you will, a world lit only by fire. No electric lights to extend the day, no modern medicine to ease suffering, no concept of human rights as we understand them today. Picture yourself in a landscape dotted with imposing stone castles, their towers and battlements looming over the countryside. Nearby, thatched-roofed cottages cluster around manor houses, smoke curling from their chimneys. In the distance, cathedral spires pierce the sky, their bells tolling to mark the canonical hours. The air would have been thick with the earthy scents of wood smoke, baking bread, and farm animals. The soundtrack of daily life, barking dogs, braying livestock, the ring of hammers from blacksmiths, the scrape of axes from woodcutters. People toiled ceaselessly from sunrise to sunset, with little respite from the daily struggle for survival. Into this world, a medieval girl was born. From her first breath, the odds were stacked against her in ways that are difficult for us to fully comprehend. This evening, we'll trace her journey from that first cry to her final breath, understanding not just what happened to medieval women, but how they experienced it, how they survived it, and how they found meaning within constraints we can barely imagine. We cannot view their world through a purely modern lens, nor judge them by our standards. Our aim is to understand the context these women inhabited, to listen to their stories with open minds, and to recognize both how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Let me tell you about birth in the medieval world. When a woman went into labor, she was attended not by doctors, for there were precious few, but by midwives and female relatives who gathered around her with whatever wisdom they'd accumulated through generations of trial and error. The birthing chamber was a place of intense superstition and desperate hope. Holy relics might be placed on the laboring woman's belly. Prayers to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, rose like incense. Sometimes, the birthing girdle of the Virgin Mary, kept in the local parish treasury, would be rushed over and placed on the mother's stomach in hopes of speeding delivery. But for all the prayers and relics, medieval childbirth remained a terrifying gamble with death. Maternal mortality rates hovered around 1 in 100 births, which meant that over a woman's reproductive lifetime, her chances of dying in childbirth were alarmingly high. For the babies who survived birth, the struggle was just beginning. Infant mortality rates were heartbreakingly high by our standards. Conservative estimates suggest that 30 to 50% of children never saw their 5th birthday. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and the simple fragility of life in an era without modern medical knowledge claimed countless young lives. The specter of an early grave hovered over every cradle. Picture a medieval mother, perhaps 16 or 17 years old herself, cradling her newborn daughter. What thoughts might have run through her mind? Relief that both she and the baby had survived the birth? Worry about the winter ahead and whether there would be enough food? Sadness that she'd borne yet another daughter instead of the son her husband desperately wanted? For you see, from the moment of birth, a girl's gender determined her worth in medieval society. Sons were celebrated, future inheritors, workers, warriors. Daughters were often viewed as burdens, mouths to feed until they could be married off to become someone else's responsibility. But let's follow our hypothetical medieval girl through her early years, understanding what childhood meant in an era when children were viewed as miniature adults with little special regard for their developmental needs. As soon as a girl could walk and talk, often by age 3 or 4, she was expected to contribute to the family economy. Childhood as a time of play, learning, and discovery simply didn't exist for most. Instead, these early years were an apprenticeship for adulthood, a time to absorb the rigid gender rules that would define the rest of her life. Educational realities. Under the watchful eye of her mother, grandmother, and older sisters, a medieval girl learned through observation and imitation. She absorbed the habits and customs that would shape her entire existence. By age 5, she might be helping to tend younger siblings, carrying water in small buckets, or gathering eggs from the henhouse. The curriculum of her informal education was narrow but intensive. Modesty, obedience, and submission were the chief virtues drilled into her, along with practical homemaking skills, cooking, sewing, spinning wool, brewing ale, tending to the sick, and managing a household's countless daily needs. Biblical stories and religious instruction formed the backbone of her moral education, cementing her understanding of women's place in what the Church taught was God's ordained hierarchy. Eve, the original sinner, who had doomed all womankind. Mary, the pure Virgin Mother, who redeemed women through her perfect submission. These were the models held up for medieval girls to emulate. While some noble daughters might learn to read and write, usually just enough to manage household accounts or correspond with family, formal education for girls was vanishingly rare. The average peasant girl would remain illiterate her entire life. Even among the upper classes, female literacy rates hovered around a mere 5%. The ideology of female inferiority. Why wasn't female education valued? The answer lies in the fundamental beliefs about women's nature that permeated medieval thinking. Drawing from ancient Greek philosophy, biblical interpretation, and medical theories, medieval scholars constructed an elaborate justification for female subordination. Women were believed to be intellectually inferior to men, too emotional, too easily swayed by passion, too weak of will to handle serious learning. Their minds were thought to be like their bodies, soft, yielding, inferior vessels, designed for supporting men and bearing children. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian, wrote that women were misbegotten males, incomplete versions of the human ideal. This wasn't considered cruel or unusual thinking, it was accepted scientific and theological truth. Given these beliefs, why waste resources educating creatures who were naturally unsuited for intellectual pursuits? Far better to focus on preparing girls for their ultimate destiny, becoming wives and mothers who would serve their husbands and raise the next generation. For a medieval girl, the transition from childhood to womanhood was often abrupt and traumatic. Unlike our modern concept of adolescence, a gradual progression with time for identity formation and gradual independence, medieval girls moved almost overnight from being children to being considered ready for marriage and motherhood. The onset of menstruation, typically around age 12 or 13, marked this transition. But rather than being a private personal milestone, it became a matter of family economics and social strategy. A girl who had begun her monthly cycles was ready to bear children, which meant she was ready to be married off to become someone else's responsibility. The Church had set minimum ages for marriage, 12 for girls, 14 for boys. But these weren't suggestions, they were commonly practiced realities. While some families, particularly among the peasantry, where girls provided valuable domestic labor, might delay marriage until the late teens, early marriage was the norm, especially among the nobility, where political alliances took precedence over personal readiness. The marriage market. Let me tell you about Isabeau of Bavaria, whose story illuminates the particular vulnerability of noble girls in this system. Born around 1370, Isabeau was considered one of the great beauties of her time. But her beauty, rather than being a blessing, made her a valuable commodity in the medieval marriage market. When Isabeau was just 15 years old, she was plucked from her relatively quiet life in Bavaria and sent to France to marry King Charles VI, a man she had never met, who was 16 years her senior, and who, unbeknownst to her family at the time, was prone to devastating bouts of mental illness. Picture this teenage girl's journey from Bavaria to France, traveling for weeks by horse and carriage, accompanied by a retinue of strangers, heading toward a future she couldn't have imagined. She was leaving behind her language, her culture, her family, everything familiar, to become queen of a foreign land. The wedding ceremony itself would have been a spectacle of political theater rather than personal celebration. Isabeau, dressed in elaborate court attire that likely felt foreign and uncomfortable, would have exchanged vows with a man whose very sanity was questionable. She was not a bride in the romantic sense we understand today. She was a diplomatic gift, a means of cementing an alliance between France and Bavaria. The reality of medieval marriage. What Isabeau experienced was typical, though perhaps more extreme than most. Medieval marriage bore little resemblance to our modern ideal of partnership based on love, mutual respect, and shared decision-making. Instead, it was fundamentally a business transaction, a transfer of property and allegiances disguised in religious ceremony. For common folk, marriage negotiations might involve discussions of dowries, inheritance rights, and labor arrangements. The bride's family typically provided a dowry, money, goods, or land to secure the match. In return, the groom's family offered a dower, which would support the bride if she were widowed. But nowhere in these negotiations was the bride's opinion sought or valued. She was consulted about her own marriage roughly as much as a prize horse might be consulted about which stable it preferred. The wedding ceremony itself was often a simple affair for peasants, an exchange of vows before witnesses, perhaps blessed by a priest if one was available. Only the nobility could afford elaborate celebrations, and even then, the focus was on sealing alliances and celebrating the families joining together, not on the individual couple's happiness. The trauma of transition. Try to imagine the psychological impact of this transition. A girl who had lived her entire life surrounded by family, in familiar surroundings, speaking her native language, suddenly found herself in a stranger's household. She was expected to quickly adapt to unfamiliar customs, navigate relationships with her husband's relatives, and establish her place in a new domestic hierarchy. The concept of a honeymoon period for adjustment didn't exist. The new bride was expected to immediately assume her wifely duties, managing household affairs, overseeing servants, if the family was wealthy enough to have them, and most critically, becoming pregnant as quickly as possible. The pressure to conceive immediately was immense. A woman's primary value lay in her fertility. The sooner she could produce children, particularly male children, the more secure her position in her new family would become. But this pressure came with its own terrors, as we'll explore in depth. For now, let's stay with our young bride in those first terrifying weeks and months of marriage. Imagine Isabeau, 15 years old, trying to learn the complex etiquette of the French court while also managing a household and attempting to understand her unstable husband's needs and moods. When Charles VI suffered his first major episode of madness just a few years into their marriage, Isabeau found herself in an impossible position. Not yet 20 years old, She was suddenly expected to help govern a kingdom, while her husband raved and refused to recognize her or their children. To understand the lives of medieval women, we must first understand the ideological framework that justified their subordination. This wasn't simply a matter of men being stronger or more aggressive. Medieval society had constructed an elaborate philosophical and theological justification for female inferiority that permeated every aspect of daily life. The Church's teaching on women. The Catholic Church, which dominated medieval European thought, taught that women were fundamentally flawed beings. The story of Eve's temptation in the Garden of Eden wasn't just ancient history, it was the explanation for why women couldn't be trusted with authority, education, or independence. The Church's teaching couldn't be simpler. As the descendants of Eve, all women carried this original stain. But the Church's teaching created a paradox that would torment medieval women. While they were condemned as inherently sinful, they were simultaneously expected to achieve impossible standards of purity. They were to be obedient like Mary, chaste like the saints, and submissive like the ideal Christian wife described in biblical texts. This created what we might call the medieval women's double bind. If a woman was too assertive, too knowledgeable, or too independent, she was clearly succumbing to Eve's prideful nature. But if she was too passive, too ignorant, or too dependent, she might be failing in her duties as a Christian woman to properly manage her household and raise godly children. Legal non-existence. Medieval law treated women as legal non-entities. Under a system that historians call coverture, a woman's legal identity was completely subsumed under that of her father or husband. She couldn't own property in her own name, couldn't enter into contracts, couldn't represent herself in court. If a woman was wronged, cheated by a merchant, injured by a neighbor, even assaulted, she couldn't seek legal remedy on her own behalf. Her husband or father would have to pursue justice for her, and they might well decide that their own interests lay in avoiding conflict rather than defending her rights. This legal invisibility extended to criminal law as well. If a woman committed a crime, her husband could be held responsible. But this supposed protection was a double-edged sword, because it also meant he had the authority to control and punish her behavior in whatever way he saw fit. Medical misunderstanding. Medieval medical knowledge about women's bodies was a mixture of ancient Greek theories, Christian theology, and pure superstition. Physicians, who were always men, as women were forbidden from formal medical training, believed that women were essentially incomplete versions of men. According to the prevailing medical theory, derived from ancient Greek sources, women were colder and more moist than men. This supposedly explained everything from their smaller stature to their emotional nature, to their supposed intellectual deficiencies. Menstruation was seen as evidence of women's inherent corruption, a monthly purging of evil humors that proved their bodies were fundamentally polluted. These medical theories had devastating practical consequences. Women's health complaints were routinely dismissed as hysteria or moral failings. Pregnancy complications were attributed to the mother's sins. Mental health issues were explained as divine punishment for women's inherent wickedness. Let's return to our young bride, now settled, however uncomfortably, into her new household. The wedding ceremony is over, the guests have departed, and she faces the reality of married life. For many medieval women, this was when the true nature of their new existence became clear. The concept of marital assault simply didn't exist in medieval thinking. A husband had unlimited sexual access to his wife's body. It was considered one of his fundamental rights, like his right to her labor or her obedience. The church taught that wives should submit to their husbands in all things, and this explicitly included sexual submission regardless of the woman's desires, health, or readiness. Medieval medical texts actually reinforced this by claiming that women's sexual pleasure was necessary for conception. This created a twisted logic. If a woman became pregnant, clearly she had enjoyed the encounter, regardless of what she claimed. If she didn't conceive, well, perhaps she had been insufficiently enthusiastic in her wifely duties. The pressure to conceive. From the moment the wedding vows were exchanged, the clock started ticking. A new bride was expected to become pregnant within the first year of marriage. If she didn't, whispers would begin. Was she barren? Was she secretly using herbs to prevent pregnancy? Was God punishing the family for some sin? The pressure was particularly intense for noble families, where inheritance and political stability depended on male heirs. But even peasant families desperately wanted sons who could work the land and support their parents in old age. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, exemplified the medieval expectation of royal motherhood. Over the course of 28 years, she endured 16 pregnancies. Let me repeat that, 16 pregnancies. Some ended in miscarriage, some produced daughters, but Eleanor kept trying because her duty was clear: produce male heirs to secure the dynasty. Think about what this meant for Eleanor's body, her health, her very sense of self. She spent the majority of her adult life either pregnant or recovering from childbirth. When she wasn't carrying a child, she was nursing one. Her body belonged not to herself, but to the English crown, a vessel for producing the next generation of Plantagenet kings. The dangers of childbirth. Medieval pregnancy and childbirth were fraught with dangers that modern medicine has largely eliminated. Without understanding of infection, proper nutrition, or surgical intervention, complications that we might easily treat today were often fatal. Many women suffered from rickets, a vitamin D deficiency caused by poor nutrition and lack of sunlight. This disease deformed their pelvises, making labor even more difficult and dangerous. A delivery might take days or even a week of agonizing pain. If labor stalled, there was little midwives could do except pray and apply folk remedies. Herbs like pennyroyal and tansy were known to induce labor, but they were also dangerous, potentially causing hemorrhaging or poisoning. Midwives walked a fine line between helping and harming, working with limited knowledge and crude tools. If complications arose, if the baby was breached, if bleeding wouldn't stop, if fever set in, medieval medicine had few answers. A mother might die of infection days after what seemed like a successful delivery. A baby might survive birth only to succumb to the diseases that ran rampant in medieval communities. Margaret of Flanders, a case study in vulnerability. Even noble birth provided little protection from male violence and abuse. The story of Margaret of Flanders illustrates just how vulnerable even high-born women could be to the whims of the men in their lives. Born in 1350, Margaret was the daughter of Louis II, Count of Flanders. As his only heir, she stood to inherit one of the richest territories in Europe, making her an extremely valuable prize in the medieval marriage market. At age 11, she was married to Philip of Rouvres, Duke of Burgundy. When he died 4 years later, the teenage Margaret found herself a very wealthy widow. Her father quickly arranged another political marriage, this time to Philip the Bold, also of Burgundy. But Margaret's cousin, Louis III of Maille, had other plans. He wanted to keep control of Flanders within the family. So, in a move that shocks us today, but was not uncommon then, he simply abducted his young cousin. One can only imagine Margaret's terror as she was seized by armed men and spirited away to Ghent.
She had no say in the matter as the men in her life fought over her considerable fortune. Though her father eventually retrieved her and forced through the original betrothal, the incident demonstrates how even elite women were pawns in men's power games. But Louis III of Maille wasn't finished with Margaret. Years later, after she had married Philip the Bold and borne several children, Louis accused her of adultery, a charge that was almost certainly fabricated. Using this pretext, he abducted her again, this time imprisoning her in her own castle for nearly 2 years. During this imprisonment, Margaret endured unimaginable abuse. Louis threatened her with death, forced her to sign away her rights to various territories, and psychologically tormented her. When she finally managed to escape and flee to her father, her ordeal was far from over. Louis III of Maille
Successfully argued in court that a wife was essentially the property of her husband and had the right to correct her behavior as he saw fit. Despite the obviously fabricated nature of the adultery charges, despite the clear evidence of Louis's cruelty, Margaret was forced to return to her abuser. Domestic violence as social norm. Margaret's story was extreme, but not unique. Domestic violence was so commonplace in medieval society that it was barely remarked upon. The 15th century legal text Liber Extra explicitly stated, "A man may chastise his wife and beat her for her own correction, for she belongs to him." Husbands were not just permitted but expected to physically discipline their wives if they were disobedient, argumentative, or failed in their duties. The only real constraint was that a man shouldn't permanently damage his wife. After all, she was valuable property. For peasant women, domestic violence often erupted from the grinding stress of poverty and overwork. Families of 8 or 10 people might share a single room, creating tension and conflict. Men who spent their days in back-breaking agricultural labor often took out their frustrations on their wives and children. Among the nobility, violence might be more controlled. A lord couldn't afford to have his wife appearing at court with obvious bruises, but it was no less real. Behind the closed doors of castle chambers, many noble women endured systematic abuse with no recourse. Chapter 5. Daily Life and Endless Labor. 80 minutes to 120 minutes. Now let's step inside the daily reality of a medieval woman's life. Forget any romantic notions you might have about leisurely ladies in flowing gowns spending their days in pleasant conversation. For women at every social level, life was defined by constant, exhausting labor. The peasant woman's day. Our typical peasant woman's day began before dawn. In a one-room cottage shared with her husband, children, and possibly elderly relatives or livestock, privacy was unknown. The floor was hard-packed earth, cold and damp. If her family was slightly better off, there might be rough wooden planks, but these were luxury items beyond most families' reach. Her first task was to coax life back into the banked coals of the hearth fire. Without matches, starting a fire could mean the difference between a warm meal and a cold, hungry day. She'd blow gently on the embers, add kindling, nurse the flames until they were strong enough to heat the iron pot that would cook the family's breakfast. That breakfast was typically pottage, a watery stew made from whatever vegetables could be spared from winter stores, perhaps flavored with a precious scrap of salted pork on feast days. The medieval peasant diet was monotonous and often inadequate. Bread, when available, was dense and dark, made from whatever grains the family could afford. Often this meant bread from barley, oats, or even peas. Wheat bread was for the wealthy. After feeding her family, our peasant woman might spend the morning hauling water from the village well or nearby stream. Without indoor plumbing, this was a constant, back-breaking chore. Water was needed for cooking, cleaning, washing, and drinking. A single day's worth might require a dozen trips with heavy buckets. Then came the endless cycle of food preparation. In a world without refrigeration or preserved foods, every meal had to be planned and prepared from scratch. If the family kept chickens, she'd gather eggs and feed the birds. If they had a cow or goat, milking was required twice daily. Gardens needed tending, even in winter when she might be checking root cellars and planning for spring planting. The art of making do. Medieval women were masters of what we might call make-do economics. Nothing could be wasted. Scraps of fabric became patches, vegetable peelings went to feed animals, even human waste was carefully collected and used to fertilize crops. When clothes wore out, and they wore out quickly given the rough fabric and constant use, women didn't simply discard them. They became rags for cleaning, material for patches, or were unraveled to reuse the thread. A single garment might be remade several times as it passed from adult to child to cleaning rag to eventual fuel for the fire. Soap was a luxury item that most families couldn't afford to purchase. Instead, women made their own from animal fat and ash, a process that was both time-consuming and unpleasant. The result was a harsh, caustic substance that cleaned adequately, but was rough on skin that was already chapped and worn from constant labor. Candles were another necessity that had to be made at home. Women would save every scrap of animal fat, melt it down, and dip wicks repeatedly to build up layers of tallow. The process was tedious, and the result was a smoky, foul-smelling light source that was still precious because it extended the useful hours of the day. Spinning, the universal female task. Of all the tasks that defined medieval women's lives, perhaps none was more universal than spinning. The need for thread and yarn was constant, for making and mending clothes, for weaving cloth, for countless household uses. The spinning wheel wasn't invented until the late 13th century, so most women spent countless hours with a simple spindle and distaff twisting fibers into thread. This work was so associated with women that spinster became the term for an unmarried woman, literally one who spins. Noble ladies might have servants to do the actual spinning, but they were still expected to oversee the work and often participated themselves. The amount of time this consumed is hard for us to imagine. It might take an entire day of spinning to produce enough thread for a few hours of weaving. A single garment could represent weeks or months of labor when you factored in the time needed to prepare the fibers, spin the thread, weave the cloth, and sew the final product. Noble women's constraints. Wealthy women were freed from much of the physical drudgery that consumed peasant women's lives, but they faced their own set of restrictions and expectations. A noble woman was expected to embody the ideals of medieval femininity. She should be beautiful but modest, educated but not too learned, pious but not presumptuous. Her days were filled with socially acceptable feminine activities: needlework, music, overseeing servants, charitable works, and religious devotions. But these activities, while less physically demanding than peasant labor, were no less constrained by rigid expectations. Take needlework, for example. This wasn't simply a pleasant hobby. It was a crucial skill that demonstrated a woman's virtue and capability. The quality of a woman's embroidery was taken as evidence of her moral character. Neat, precise stitches suggested a disciplined, godly nature. Sloppy work implied a careless, possibly immoral disposition. Noble women spent countless hours creating elaborate tapestries, altar cloths, and ecclesiastical vestments. These works of art were not expressions of personal creativity, but demonstrations of their devotion to God and their families. The subjects were strictly regulated: religious scenes, family heraldry, or occasionally courtly love themes that had been approved by male authorities. Despite the overwhelming constraints placed upon them, medieval women found ways to resist, subvert, and occasionally transcend the limitations of their society. These acts of resistance ranged from quiet daily rebellions to dramatic public defiance. Christine de Pizan, The Power of the Pen. Perhaps no medieval woman better exemplifies the possibility of resistance through intellectual achievement than Christine de Pizan. Born in Venice in 1364, Christine had the extraordinary good fortune to be the daughter of a progressive father who believed in educating his daughter alongside his sons. When her family moved to the French court, where her father served as physician and astrologer to King Charles V, Christine received an education that was virtually unique for women of her time. She learned Latin and French, studied classical literature and philosophy, and had access to the king's magnificent library. At 15, Christine was married to Etienne du Castel, a nobleman and royal secretary. By all accounts, it was a love match as well as a strategic alliance. Christine bore 3 children and seemed destined for a conventional noblewoman's life of domestic management and child-rearing. But tragedy struck in quick succession. An outbreak of plague claimed her beloved husband's life, followed soon after by her father's death. At 25, Christine found herself a widow with 3 young children, facing financial ruin in a society that had little use for educated women without male protection. What Christine did next was virtually unprecedented. She became Europe's first professional female author, supporting her family through her writing. Starting with conventional love ballads and devotional poetry, genres deemed appropriately feminine, she gradually expanded into more challenging territory. Her masterwork, The Book of the City of Ladies, was nothing short of revolutionary. In this allegorical text, Christine imagined a utopian city populated and governed entirely by women. She systematically dismantled the misogynistic arguments of her day, celebrating the achievements of great women throughout history and arguing for the fundamental equality of the sexes. Christine wrote, "No matter which way I turn, no matter where I cast my eyes, I see nothing but the cruelty of men towards women. And yet God knows women are not of a different species from men. They are human beings just as much as men are." Hildegard of Bingen, mystic and scholar. Another extraordinary figure was Hildegard of Bingen, born in 1098 to a noble German family. As the 10th child, she was tithed to the church and sent to live in a monastery at age 8. Rather than being crushed by this religious life, Hildegard flourished. From childhood, she experienced mystical visions that she carefully documented. Her theological writings were groundbreaking, offering fresh interpretations of Christian doctrine. Her musical compositions, over 70 surviving pieces, were unlike anything of her time, featuring soaring melodies and innovative structures. But Hildegard's influence extended far beyond theology and music. She was also a physician, botanist, and natural philosopher. Her medical texts described hundreds of plants and their healing properties. She performed surgeries, treated complex ailments, and corresponded with physicians across Europe. As abbess of her own monastery, Hildegard wielded considerable political influence. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings who sought her spiritual advice. When she felt the church was becoming corrupt, she didn't hesitate to voice her criticisms publicly. What made Hildegard's achievements possible was the unique space that monastic life provided for exceptional women. Within convent walls, removed from the pressures of marriage and motherhood, some women could pursue intellectual and spiritual development that would have been impossible in secular society. For women who could avoid or escape marriage, religious life offered an alternative path. Convents provided one of the few acceptable spaces where women could live independently of male authority. though always under the ultimate supervision of male church hierarchies. Life and the convent. The daily routine of monastic life was rigorous, but offered certain freedoms unavailable to secular women. Nuns rose before dawn for the first prayers of the day, followed by a schedule of worship, work, and study that continued until evening. Unlike their married sisters, nuns controlled their own time and bodies. They took vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, but the obedience was to God and their abbess, not to a husband who might abuse or exploit them. Within the convent, women could pursue learning, artistic expression, and spiritual development. Many convents became centers of female scholarship and culture. Nuns copied manuscripts, illuminated religious texts, composed music, and maintained libraries. They studied theology, philosophy, and natural sciences. Some became renowned scholars, whose opinions were sought by male intellectuals. The scriptorium, the room where manuscripts were copied, was often the domain of educated nuns who preserved classical and religious texts for future generations. Their precise, beautiful handwriting filled thousands of pages with everything from biblical commentaries to medical treatises to works of literature. The anchoresses, ultimate withdrawal. At the extreme end of religious devotion were the anchoresses, women who chose to be literally walled into cells attached to churches, spending the rest of their lives in solitary prayer and contemplation. This might seem like a horrific fate to modernize, but for some medieval women, it represented the ultimate freedom. Julian of Norwich, the most famous English anchoress, made this choice in her early 30s. After experiencing a series of mystical visions during a near-fatal illness, she requested to be permanently enclosed in a cell attached to St. Julian's Church in Norwich. The enclosure ceremony was deliberately designed to resemble a funeral. The bishop sprinkled the threshold of her cell with dust and intoned, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust." As the final brick was laid, Julian was considered dead to the world she had known. Her cell was perhaps 12 feet by 8 feet, with 3 windows, one facing the church interior, where she could observe Mass, one facing outside, where she could speak with visitors seeking spiritual counsel, and one where her servant could pass food and necessities. For modern readers, this might seem like a form of imprisonment worse than any secular penalty. But Julian's own writings suggest a different perspective. In her Revelations of Divine Love, believed to be the first book written in English by a woman, she describes her visions with joy and wonder. For Julian, the anchor hold represented freedom from the expectations and dangers of secular female life. She didn't have to worry about pleasing a husband, bearing children, or managing a household. Her relationship was directly with God, unmediated by male authority figures. Networks of female support. Whether in convents or secular life, medieval women created networks of mutual support that helped them survive their constrained circumstances. These relationships were often the difference between despair and hope, between survival and disaster. In villages, women gathered regularly for shared tasks like laundry, food preparation, and textile work. These gatherings weren't just about efficiency, they were vital social connections, where women could share information, offer emotional support, and maintain the oral traditions that preserved their community's knowledge. During childbirth, a woman was attended not just by a midwife, but by a group of female relatives and neighbors. These birth attendants provided not only practical help, but emotional support during one of life's most dangerous passages. They shared knowledge about herbal remedies, birthing techniques, and infant care. Women also maintained informal networks for sharing contraceptive and abortifacient knowledge. Despite the Church's prohibition on birth control, women quietly passed down information about herbs and techniques that could prevent pregnancy or induce miscarriage.
Plants like pennyroyal, tansy, and certain fungi could induce miscarriage, while rue and Queen Anne's lace worked to prevent conception. These discreet networks of women quietly shared such illicit knowledge, but even these small rebellions put them at risk of hemorrhage, infection, and accusations of witchcraft. The medieval mindset could not conceive of women controlling their own reproductive fates. Anything that enabled them to thwart a husband's prerogative was surely the devil's work. Perhaps nothing illustrates the precarious position of medieval women more clearly than the terror of witchcraft accusations that could destroy any woman's life at any moment. In a world where bad harvests, livestock diseases, or human illnesses could threaten entire communities, women made convenient scapegoats. Who was accused? The typical witch accusation followed a predictable pattern. The accused was usually a woman who stood out in some way, often negatively. Widows living alone were prime targets, as were unmarried older women, midwives, herbalists, beggars, or anyone who didn't quite fit the prescribed role of demure wife and mother. These vulnerable women made perfect scapegoats for community misfortunes. If crops failed, if babies fell ill, if men became impotent, if storms destroyed harvests, surely someone must be responsible. And who better to blame than the old woman who lived on the outskirts of town, who knew about herbs and healing, who perhaps had been heard muttering curses under her breath? The Church had provided theological justification for this scapegoating in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487. This manual explicitly argued that women were more susceptible to demonic influence due to their fickle carnal natures and inherent moral weakness. The mockery of justice. Witch trials were judicial farces with predetermined outcomes. Once accused, a woman had virtually no chance of proving her innocence. The very fact that she had been accused was taken as evidence of guilt. If she confessed under torture, she was obviously guilty. If she refused to confess, her stubborn silence proved she was in league with the devil. The accused woman would be stripped naked and searched for the devil's mark, any mole, birthmark, or blemish that supposedly proved her compact with Satan. Her hair would be shaved off to prevent her from hiding magical charms. She might be subjected to swimming, thrown into a body of water with the belief that water, being pure, would reject a witch, causing her to float. If torture was applied, and it usually was, few women could withstand the agony long enough to maintain their innocence. The confession extracted under duress would then be used to justify execution, usually by burning at the stake. The gendered nature of witch persecution. Women comprised over 80% of those executed for witchcraft between 1500 and 1660. This wasn't coincidental. It reflected deep-seated anxieties about female power and independence in a rigidly patriarchal society. The very activities that made women valuable to their communities, healing knowledge, midwifery skills, understanding of herbs and natural remedies, could easily be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural evil. A woman who could ease the pain of childbirth might just as easily be accused of causing miscarriage through malevolent magic. Midwives were particularly vulnerable. If a birth went badly, if a baby was born with deformities, if a mother died in labor, the midwife might be blamed for cursing the family. Her intimate knowledge of women's bodies and reproductive processes was inherently suspicious to male authorities who viewed female sexuality as dangerous and mysterious.
Let's return to the daily reality of medieval women's lives, because even amid oppression and danger, women found ways to create meaning, assert agency, and support each other. Managing monthly cycles. One aspect of women's experience that the historical record rarely addresses directly is menstruation, a monthly reality that presented particular challenges in an era without modern sanitary products. Most women relied on homemade cloth pads or rags that were washed and reused. These offered minimal absorption and leak protection. Some women resorted to using grass, hay, sheep's wool, or even moss stuffed into their undergarments. Chafing and infections were common problems. The medieval understanding of menstruation was colored by religious and medical misconceptions. Menstrual blood was considered polluted and dangerous. Women were thought to be unclean during their periods and were sometimes barred from handling food or entering churches. The challenge of hygiene. Bathing was a rare luxury for medieval women of all classes. Even those with access to rivers or streams faced water that was often contaminated with human and animal waste. Most people subscribed to the medical belief that water could carry illness into the body through the skin's pores. This led to infrequent bathing, perhaps a few times per year, supplemented by dry cleaning with rough cloths. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Even the wealthy couldn't escape these pests entirely, which is why one of the most treasured wedding gifts for an aristocratic bride was a flea fur, a fur wrap designed to attract fleas away from her body. Laundry was another monumental challenge. Clothing had to be washed by hand in a pot over the fire or at a river, scrubbed against a washboard, then wrung out and hung to dry. The process was backbreaking and time-consuming. With most families owning only one or two sets of clothing, the laundering process was both essential and dreaded. Food and survival. Food scarcity was a constant threat for medieval families. Even in good years, the diet of common people was monotonous and often inadequate. Women were responsible for making meager supplies stretch to feed their families, requiring constant creativity and careful planning. The medieval peasant diet centered around bread, pottage, a watery stew, and ale. Meat was a luxury reserved for feast days. Vegetables depended on what could be grown locally and preserved through winter. Protein might come from eggs, cheese, or small amounts of bacon. Women developed elaborate techniques for food preservation: smoking meats, making cheese, fermenting vegetables, brewing ale that was safer to drink than contaminated water. These skills were passed down from mother to daughter as precious knowledge essential for family survival. Textile production, a female economy. One area where women did exercise significant economic influence was in textile production. While men dominated agriculture and most trades, the production of cloth was largely a female domain. Women sheared sheep, cleaned and prepared wool, spun it into thread, wove cloth, and created finished garments. This was skilled, valuable work that could provide a measure of economic independence. Some women became professional spinners, weavers, or seamstresses, selling their products in local markets. Wealthy women might oversee large textile operations, employing dozens of female workers. The production of luxury fabrics, silk, fine wool, elaborately embroidered garments, could be quite profitable. Religious life presented medieval women with both the greatest constraints and the greatest opportunities for freedom. The church that preached their inferiority also provided the only socially acceptable alternative to marriage and motherhood. Catherine of Siena, speaking truth to power. Saint Catherine of Siena, born in 1347, exemplified how religious calling could empower women to challenge even the highest authorities. From early childhood, Catherine was intensely devout, much to her parents' concern. They wanted her to marry advantageously, but Catherine resisted all attempts to arrange a match. At 18, she joined the Dominican tertiaries, lay sisters who took religious vows but lived in the secular world. This gave Catherine freedom to move about, correspond with church leaders, and involve herself in religious and political affairs. Catherine learned to read and write, unusual for women of her background, and began an extensive correspondence with popes, princes, and church officials. Her letters were remarkably bold, criticizing corruption and calling for reform. When the papacy had relocated to Avignon, leaving Rome, Catherine wrote scathing letters demanding the pope's return. Incredibly, Pope Gregory XI listened to this young laywoman's counsel. In 1377, he returned the papacy to Rome, ending what historians call the Avignon papacy. Catherine's influence on one of the most significant events of her era demonstrates the potential power that exceptional women could wield through religious authority. The price of religious freedom. However, even women who found relative freedom in religious life paid significant costs. Nuns renounced marriage, motherhood, and worldly pleasures. They lived under strict rules governing their behavior, speech, and activities. While they might escape male domination in marriage, they remained under the authority of male church hierarchies. Anchoresses like Julian of Norwich chose even more extreme isolation. Julian spent decades in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, never again seeing the world beyond her small windows. While she found spiritual fulfillment in this life, the physical and psychological cost was enormous. Many women entered religious life not from calling but from necessity. Unmarriageable daughters, widows without means, women fleeing abusive marriages, convents served as refuges for women who had nowhere else to turn. Some found genuine spiritual purpose in this life, but others endured it as merely another form of constraint. Mystical religious experience and female authority. Interestingly, mystical religious experience was one area where medieval women could claim authority that men couldn't easily challenge. If a woman claimed direct revelation from God, male authorities had to tread carefully in dismissing her claims. Women like Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, and Catherine of Siena used their mystical experiences to develop theological insights that influenced Christian thought for centuries. Julian's visions led her to describe God in maternal terms. God is our mother as truly as he is our father, a radical departure from standard patriarchal theology. These mystical women walked a fine line. Their visions had to conform closely enough to orthodox doctrine to avoid charges of heresy, but many managed to introduce subtle innovations that expanded understanding of divine love and mercy. To truly understand medieval women's lives, we need to immerse ourselves in the rhythm of their days and seasons. Modern life, with its electric lights and climate control, has severed our connection to the natural cycles that governed medieval existence. The medieval day. A medieval woman's day began in the darkness before dawn. Without clocks, time was marked by the church bells calling the faithful to prayer at canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. These bells regulated not just religious observance, but the entire community's schedule. Rising in the cold darkness, a woman's first task was reviving the banked coals of the hearth fire. This wasn't simply a matter of striking a match. It required skill and patience to coax flame from embers without wasting precious fuel. A failed fire meant a cold, hungry start to the day. Once the fire was established, she could begin preparing the morning meal while other family members still slept. This might be the only time of day she had anything approaching solitude, working quietly in the flickering firelight before the demands of others took over. As dawn broke, the household would stir. Children needed to be fed, dressed, and given their daily tasks. Her husband might require a meal before heading to the fields or his workshop. If there were animals, chickens, a cow, perhaps a pig, they needed feeding and milking. The weight of water. One of the most physically demanding aspects of medieval women's lives was water management. Without indoor plumbing, every drop had to be carried by hand from wells, streams, or rivers. A single household might require 20 to 30 gallons per day for cooking, drinking, cleaning, and basic sanitation. Imagine making 6 or 8 trips daily to the village well, carrying heavy wooden buckets that grew heavier with each step back home. In winter, the well might be frozen or the path treacherous with ice. In summer, the nearest water source might be far from the village if local wells ran dry. Water for laundry required even more hauling. Clothes had to be boiled in large cauldrons to kill lice and remove accumulated dirt. The wet garments were then heavy and difficult to wring out and hang. Wash day was a community affair, with women gathering at streams to share the labor and socialize while they worked. Food, the constant struggle. Food preparation consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. Without refrigeration, preservation, or prepared foods, every meal required planning and labor. Grain had to be ground into flour using a hand quern, a laborious process that left women's arms and backs aching. Bread baking was a weekly ordeal. Women would prepare large batches of dough, then carry them to the village baker's oven. Few households had their own ovens. The timing had to be precise. Arrive too late, and the oven would be cooling. Too early, and you'd waste precious fuel. Vegetables came from kitchen gardens that women tended in addition to their other duties. They grew cabbages, onions, leeks, peas, and herbs for seasoning and medicine. In autumn, they worked frantically to preserve the harvest for winter, drying vegetables, making sauerkraut, storing root vegetables in cellars. Meat was rare and precious. When animals were slaughtered, women had to work quickly to preserve every scrap. They made sausages, rendered fat for cooking and candles, and used every organ for food or other purposes. Nothing could be wasted. Textile work, the never-ending task. Spinning, weaving, and sewing consumed whatever time remained after cooking, cleaning, and childcare. In an era before ready-made clothing, women had to create garments for their entire families from raw materials. The process began with sheep shearing in spring. Women cleaned the wool, removing burrs and debris, then prepared it for spinning. Using a simple spindle and distaff, they twisted fibers into thread, a task so time-consuming that it filled spare moments throughout the day. Even with the invention of the spinning wheel in the late 13th century, producing thread remained laborious. It might take a week of spinning to create enough thread for a single garment. Then came weaving the cloth, cutting patterns, and sewing pieces together by hand. When clothing inevitably wore out, and it wore out quickly given the rough fabric and constant use, women carefully dismantled garments to reuse every scrap of fabric. Patches upon patches extended the life of clothes that represented weeks or months of labor. Living in constant fear of male violence was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of medieval women's existence. This violence took many forms, from casual domestic abuse to sexual assault, to the systematic persecution of women labeled as witches. The normalization of domestic violence. Medieval society not only tolerated domestic violence, it actively encouraged it as a tool of social control. Religious authorities preached that wives should submit to their husband's discipline, while legal authorities codified men's right to correct their wives physically. The violence wasn't always extreme. Many medieval texts describe what they considered reasonable correction: a slap for talking back, a beating for burning dinner,
confinement for being too friendly with neighbors. But the potential for escalation was always present, and women had virtually no recourse when their husbands went too far. Court records from medieval England describe cases of husbands who broke their wives' bones, burned them with hot irons, or kept them chained. Even when neighbors witnessed such extreme abuse, intervention was rare. Domestic matters were considered private, and a man's authority over his wife was sacred. Violence as inevitable. The concept of marital assault simply did not exist in medieval legal or moral thinking. Marriage gave husbands unlimited sexual access to their wives' bodies. Her consent was irrelevant. Her wedding vows had given permanent consent to whatever her husband desired. But sexual violence extended far beyond marriage. Single women, servants, and peasants were particularly vulnerable to assault by men of higher social rank. A lord who RAC'd a peasant woman faced few consequences. His word would always be taken over hers, and her family was likely to risk challenging someone who controlled their livelihood. Even when RAC'd was acknowledged, the focus was on property damage rather than personal violation. If an unmarried virgin was assaulted, the crime was seen as theft of her father's property, her virginity, which determined her marriage value. The solution was often to force the rapist to marry his victim, restoring her honor while ignoring her trauma. Living in constant fear of male violence for medieval women is one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of medieval women's existence.
Living with fear. This climate of sanctioned violence created an atmosphere of constant vigilance for medieval women. They learned to read men's moods, to avoid situations that might provoke anger, to make themselves small and unobtrusive. Women developed strategies for self-protection within their constraints. They formed alliances with other women who could serve as witnesses or provide refuge. They learned which men to avoid and which paths through town were safest. They passed down warnings and advice to their daughters about navigating a world where their safety was never guaranteed. Despite the overwhelming constraints placed upon them, some medieval women managed to transcend their circumstances and leave lasting marks on history. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest periods, human potential finds ways to flourish. Joan of Arc, the peasant who challenged kings. Perhaps no medieval woman better embodies the possibility of transcending social constraints than Joan of Arc. Born around 1412 to a peasant family in northeastern France, Joan seemed destined for the typical life of rural drudgery that awaited most girls of her class. But Joan claimed to receive visions from Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine, instructing her to drive the English out of France and secure the crown for the Dauphin Charles. At age 17, she convinced local authorities to grant her an audience with the court. Imagine the audacity required for a teenage peasant girl to approach the future king of France and claim divine authority to lead his armies. Yet somehow, Joan's conviction and charisma persuaded Charles to give her military command. Dressed in men's clothing and armor, itself a violation of social and religious norms, Joan led French forces to several crucial victories. Her presence revitalized French morale and changed the course of the Hundred Years' War. Of course, Joan's story ended tragically. Captured by English allies, she was tried for heresy and witchcraft, largely because she had dared to wear men's clothing and claim divine authority. At age 19, she was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. The political acumen of medieval queens. While most medieval women were excluded from political power, queens and noblewomen sometimes wielded significant influence behind the scenes. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, was one of the most powerful figures of the 12th century. Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, Eleanor married first King Louis VII of France, then King Henry II of England. She controlled vast territories, led a crusade, and played crucial roles in the political maneuvering of her era. When she disagreed with Henry II's policies, she led a rebellion against him, spending 16 years under house arrest as punishment. Eleanor's daughter-in-law, Berengaria of Navarre, accompanied her husband, Richard the Lionheart, on the Third Crusade, one of the few women to journey to the Holy Land during the crusading period. While officially she had no military role, Berengaria's presence provided crucial diplomatic connections and moral support for the crusading forces. Women in trade and commerce. In medieval towns and cities, some women managed to carve out economic independence through trade and commerce. Widows often inherited their husbands' businesses and proved quite capable of running them. In many guilds, widows were granted membership rights and could continue their late husband's work. Some women became successful entrepreneurs in their own right. The famous Margery Kempe, a 15th-century Englishwoman, ran both a brewery and a mill before embarking on religious pilgrimages that took her across Europe and to the Holy Land. Women merchants could be found in markets across Europe, selling everything from bread and ale to luxury fabrics and imported spices. While they faced discrimination and restrictive regulations, some managed to build substantial businesses and accumulate considerable wealth. Healers and medical practitioners. Despite official prohibitions, many women practiced medicine and healing throughout the medieval period. Their knowledge of herbs, anatomy, and traditional remedies made them invaluable to their communities, even as it put them at risk of persecution. Midwifery remained almost exclusively female throughout the medieval period. These women developed sophisticated understanding of childbirth, pregnancy complications, and infant care. They knew which herbs could ease labor pains, stop bleeding, or treat infections. Some women became renowned surgeons and physicians despite legal barriers. In 14th-century Paris, Jacqueline Felicia d'Almania was prosecuted by the university medical faculty for practicing medicine without a license. Her patients, including priests and noblewomen, testified passionately on her behalf, praising her diagnostic skills and successful treatments. The court records reveal that Jacqueline had developed innovative surgical techniques and had a higher success rate than many licensed male physicians. Nevertheless, she was excommunicated and barred from practice, illustrating how institutional barriers could override obvious competence. For married women, pregnancy was not an occasional blessed event, but a recurring ordeal that dominated their adult lives. Without effective contraception, and with husbands who viewed frequent pregnancy as proof of their wives' virtue, women faced an exhausting cycle of conception, pregnancy, birth, nursing, and recovery before the cycle began again. Eleanor of Castile, a royal example. Queen Eleanor of Castile's reproductive history provides a stark illustration of what medieval motherhood entailed. Over 28 years of marriage to Edward I of England, Eleanor endured 16 pregnancies. These weren't 16 joyful announcements of expanding family, they were 16 life-threatening ordeals that gradually destroyed her health. Medieval records suggest that at least 3 of Eleanor's babies were stillborn or died shortly after birth. Several others died in infancy from the diseases that ravaged medieval communities. Each loss was not just a personal tragedy, but a political crisis, as the royal succession depended on surviving male heirs. The constant pregnancy and nursing took a severe toll on Eleanor's body. Historical accounts describe her suffering from a prolapsed uterus in her later years, a painful condition that modern medicine easily treats, which medieval medicine could only endure. Eleanor's final pregnancy at age 49 proved fatal. She died shortly after giving birth, her body finally unable to withstand another delivery. Her death was mourned throughout England, but within months Edward I was negotiating a new marriage to secure additional political alliances. The peasant motherhood, survival against odds. For peasant women, pregnancy and childbirth lacked even the minimal medical attention available to queens. They gave birth in one-room cottages, often while continuing their daily labor until the very moment of delivery. Malnutrition was common among peasant women, leaving them weakened and vulnerable to complications. Many suffered from rickets, which deformed their pelvises and made delivery extremely difficult. Labor might last for days without relief. If complications arose, peasant women had to rely on the knowledge of local midwives and female relatives. Herbal remedies might ease pain or speed delivery, but they could also be dangerous. Women who hemorrhaged or developed infections often died for lack of proper medical care. The babies who survived birth faced their own challenges. Inadequate nutrition meant that mothers couldn't produce enough milk to nurse properly. Infant formulas didn't exist, so babies who couldn't nurse often starved. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and dysentery claimed countless young lives. Contraception and control. Despite the Church's teachings against birth control, women quietly shared knowledge about preventing pregnancy. Desperation drove them to seek any means of controlling their reproductive lives, even when such knowledge put them at risk of accusations of witchcraft. Herbal contraceptives and abortifacients were passed down through networks of women. Queen Anne's lace seeds, consumed immediately after intercourse, could prevent implantation. Pennyroyal and tansy could induce miscarriage, though both were dangerous and could cause fatal poisoning. Some women resorted to more extreme measures. Deliberate malnutrition could prevent conception, though it also damaged overall health. Physical trauma to the abdomen might cause miscarriage, but it could also cause internal injuries or death. The desperation that drove women to these dangerous practices reveals the crushing burden of constant pregnancy in an era when each birth might mean death and each surviving child meant another mouth to feed from already inadequate resources. While medieval women were legally and socially subordinated to men, their economic contributions were absolutely essential to society's functioning. Women's labor, though undervalued and often invisible, formed the backbone of medieval economic life. Agricultural work. Despite ideological beliefs about women's weakness, medieval agriculture depended heavily on female labor. Peasant women worked alongside their husbands during planting and harvest seasons, performing backbreaking labor in fields from dawn to dusk. Women specialized in certain agricultural tasks. They were responsible for tending kitchen gardens that provided vegetables for their families. They raised chickens, gathered eggs, and managed dairy production. During harvest time, they worked in the fields gleaning leftover grain, a laborious process that could provide crucial additional food for winter survival. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural work meant periods of intense labor followed by relatively quieter winter months. But even in winter, women's work continued. They processed and preserved the harvest, repaired clothing and household items, and prepared for the next planting season. Urban women and trade. In medieval towns and cities, women found more diverse economic opportunities. Many worked alongside their husbands in family businesses, learning skills that could support them if they were widowed. Bakers' wives learned to bake. Merchants' wives learned to keep accounts and negotiate with suppliers. Some women operated their own businesses. Female brewers were common throughout medieval Europe. Brewing ale was considered women's work because it was an extension of food preparation. These alewives could earn substantial incomes, and some became quite wealthy. Female textile workers dominated cloth production. While men might control the wool trade and own looms, the actual work of spinning, weaving, and finishing cloth was largely performed by women. In cities like Florence and Bruges, thousands of women earned their living in textile workshops. The underground economy. For women without husbands or family support, survival often meant participation in underground economic activities. Prostitution, while officially condemned, was tacitly accepted as a necessary evil in most medieval cities. Cities like London, Paris, and Florence had designated red light districts where prostitution was regulated and taxed. Women who worked in these areas had some legal protection, though they faced constant moral condemnation and health risks. Outside these designated areas, prostitution was more dangerous. Women caught soliciting faced fines, public humiliation, and physical punishment. But for many widows, unmarried women, and those fleeing abusive situations, it represented one of the few ways to earn survival income. To understand how thoroughly medieval society controlled women, we need to examine the language and imagery used to describe femininity. Words have power, and medieval society wielded language as a tool of oppression with devastating effectiveness. The vocabulary of female inferiority. Medieval texts are filled with derogatory terms for women that reveal deep-seated misogyny. Women were described as the weaker vessel, emphasizing their supposed physical and moral frailty. They were daughters of Eve, forever tainted by the original sin of their first mother. Female sexuality was described in particularly harsh terms. Women who expressed sexual desire were wanton, lustful, or lecherous. But women who didn't produce children were barren or cursed. The language created impossible standards. Women were condemned whether they embraced or rejected their sexuality. Older women faced especially harsh linguistic treatment. Postmenopausal women were often described as hags, crones, or withered. Having outlived their reproductive usefulness, they were seen as burdens on society. This linguistic dehumanization made it easier to justify neglecting or abusing elderly women. Religious imagery and female subordination. The Church's vast artistic and literary output consistently reinforced messages about women's proper place. Religious art depicted women primarily as mothers, like Mary, or as cautionary examples of sin, like Eve or Mary Magdalene before her conversion. Church architecture itself encoded messages about gender hierarchy. Women were often required to sit in separate sections during services, physically removed from the altar where male priests performed the sacred mysteries. In some churches, women couldn't even enter certain areas considered too holy for their polluted presence. The cycle of religious festivals throughout the year provided constant reinforcement of these messages. Saints' feast days celebrated male martyrs and scholars alongside female saints who were praised primarily for their chastity and submission. The message was clear: women's highest achievement was perfect obedience. Legal language and property rights. Medieval legal documents reveal how thoroughly the law treated women as property rather than persons. Marriage contracts discussed women using the same terminology applied to livestock or real estate. A wife was transferred from her father to her husband, along with her dowry and any inheritance rights. Widowhood was often the only time a woman might have any legal identity of her own, and even then, her rights were severely limited. A widow might control her late husband's property, but usually only until her sons came of age or she remarried. Her authority was always temporary and conditional. The language of inheritance law reveals how dynasties viewed women. While sons inherited titles and lands directly, daughters inherited only if no male heirs existed, and their inheritance would typically pass to their husbands upon marriage. Women were conduits for male inheritance, rather than inheritors in their own right. Chapter 17. Moments of Joy and Connection. Amid all this hardship and oppression, medieval women found ways to create meaning, beauty, and connection in their lives. These moments of light in the darkness remind us of their full humanity and resilience. Female friendship and community. Women's friendships provided crucial emotional support in lives otherwise dominated by male authority. Female relatives, neighbors, and friends created networks of mutual aid that helped women survive their most difficult moments. During childbirth, a woman was surrounded by other women who shared their experiences and knowledge. These birth attendants provided not just practical help, but emotional comfort during one of life's most dangerous passages. They told stories, sang songs, and offered encouragement through hours or days of labor. Women gathered regularly for shared tasks that combined work with socializing. Laundry Day brought village women together at streams and wells. Harvest time created opportunities for communal work and celebration. Even routine tasks like spinning or food preparation were often performed in groups. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond mere efficiency. They were spaces where women could speak freely about their lives, share information about everything from contraceptive herbs to abusive husbands, and maintain the oral traditions that preserved their community's knowledge. Religious devotion and spiritual life. For many medieval women, religious faith provided comfort and meaning that helped them endure their earthly struggles. While the church hierarchy oppressed them, personal devotion offered hope for justice in the afterlife and purpose in their current suffering. Women's religious practices often focused on intercessory figures who understood their specific struggles. The Virgin Mary, while held up as an impossible standard of purity, was also seen as a compassionate mother who understood the pain of watching a child suffer. Female saints provided models of women who had transcended earthly limitations through spiritual devotion. Private prayer and meditation gave women one area of life where they could be alone with their thoughts and hopes. Even in crowded peasant cottages, a woman kneeling in prayer commanded a moment of respect and space from family members. Some women found ways to express creativity through religious art and music. They embroidered altar cloths, composed devotional songs, and created beautiful, illuminated prayer books. While these activities had to be justified as service to God rather than personal expression, they still provided outlets for artistic impulses. Storytelling and cultural preservation. In the evenings, when the day's work was finally done, women often gathered to share stories. These weren't just entertainment. They were crucial vehicles for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge. Fairy tales, folk legends, and family histories were maintained and embellished through generations of female storytellers. These narratives often contained subtle messages about survival, resistance, and hope that spoke directly to women's experiences. Stories of clever women who outwitted powerful men, of faithful wives rewarded for their patience, of brave maidens who saved their communities. These tales provided both escape from daily drudgery and models for navigating difficult circumstances. Women also preserved practical knowledge through storytelling. Recipes, healing remedies, and household techniques were passed down through narratives that made them memorable and meaningful. A story about a wise woman who saved her village through knowledge of herbs carried both entertainment value and crucial survival information. we must spend significant time understanding the witch hunts because they represent the ultimate expression of medieval society's fear and hatred of female power. These persecutions reveal the lengths to which patriarchal authority would go to maintain control over women. The anatomy of an accusation. Witch accusations typically began with misfortune. A cow might sicken and die, crops might fail, a child might fall ill, and the community would look for someone to blame. The target was usually a woman who had somehow attracted negative attention. Perhaps she was a widow living alone, making her suspicious and vulnerable. Maybe she was known for her knowledge of herbs and healing, making her a convenient scapegoat when remedies failed. Or she might simply be someone who had quarreled with neighbors or failed to show proper deference to local authorities. The accusation process was designed to make defense impossible. Once named as a witch, every aspect of a woman's life would be re-examined for evidence of supernatural evil. Had she been seen talking to cats? Had she muttered under her breath when angry? Did she know too much about healing or too little about proper Christian behavior? The trial process was designed to make defense impossible. Once named as a witch, every aspect of a woman's life would be re-examined for evidence of supernatural evil. Had she been seen talking to cats? Had she muttered under her breath when angry? Did she know too much about healing or too little about proper Christian behavior? When torture was applied, and it usually was, few women could maintain their innocence. The rack, thumbscrews, and hot irons extracted confessions that were then used to justify execution. The fact that confessions were obtained under extreme duress was irrelevant to medieval courts. The gender of persecution. Women comprised over 80% of those executed for witchcraft, and this wasn't coincidental. The very qualities that made women valuable to their communities, knowledge of healing, understanding of the natural world, close relationships with neighbors, could easily be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural evil. Midwives were particularly vulnerable because they dealt with life and death, knew about herbs and remedies, and were present during the mysterious process of birth. If a delivery went badly, if a baby was born with deformities, or if a mother died, the midwife became an easy target for blame. Elderly women faced special persecution because they were seen as having outlived their usefulness. Post-menopausal women couldn't bear children, were often economically dependent, and might be bitter about their harsh lives. Their knowledge of folk remedies and their tendency to speak more freely made them convenient scapegoats. The witch hunts served multiple social functions beyond simply persecuting individual women. They reinforced male authority by demonstrating what happened to women who stepped outside prescribed roles. They provided explanations for natural disasters and personal misfortunes, and they allowed communities to eliminate inconvenient women while feeling righteous about it. One aspect of medieval women's lives that's particularly difficult for modern people to understand is the reality of personal hygiene and sanitation. Our ancestors lived with levels of dirt, smell, and physical discomfort that would be unbearable to us today. The myth of medieval cleanliness. Contrary to some modern myths, medieval people weren't indifferent to cleanliness. They valued clean clothes, fresh breath, and well-groomed appearances, but their understanding of hygiene was limited by medical theories that actually discouraged frequent bathing. Medieval physicians believed that water could carry disease into the body through skin pores. This led to medical advice against frequent bathing, which was thought to weaken the body and make it vulnerable to illness. Instead, people practiced dry cleaning, rubbing their bodies with rough linen cloths to remove dirt and dead skin. For women, these beliefs created particular challenges. They were expected to maintain attractive appearances while avoiding practices that were thought to be medically dangerous. The result was elaborate rituals of grooming that focused on what was visible: clean clothes, arranged hair, fresh breath, while accepting bodily odors and dirt as inevitable. Managing menstruation. Medieval women faced monthly challenges that modern sanitary products have made manageable. Without cotton tampons or absorbent pads, women relied on whatever materials they could find and reuse. Most women used strips of linen or wool cloth that they washed and reused throughout their reproductive years. These homemade pads offered minimal protection and had to be secured with belts or ties. Leakage was common, creating both practical problems and social embarrassment. Some women resorted to natural materials like grass, hay, sheep's wool, or moss for absorption. These materials were even less effective and could cause infections or injuries. The constant worry about leakage during menstruation added another layer of anxiety to women's already stressful lives. Medieval medicine's understanding of menstruation was colored by religious beliefs about female impurity. Menstrual blood was considered corrupted and dangerous. Women were sometimes forbidden from handling food, entering churches, or touching sacred objects during their periods. The challenge of laundry. Keeping clothes clean was a monumental task in medieval times. Without soap, hot running water, or washing machines, laundry required enormous amounts of time and physical effort. Women would heat large cauldrons of water over open fires, adding ash or urine to create alkaline solutions that could break down dirt and grease. Clothes were pounded against washing boards, twisted and wrung by hand, then hung to dry in whatever weather prevailed. The process was so labor-intensive that most families only owned a few sets of clothing. These garments were worn until they literally fell apart, then carefully dismantled so the fabric could be reused for patches or other purposes. Linen undergarments, when they existed at all, were precious items that might be washed more frequently, but outer garments might go months between washing, leading to accumulations of dirt, sweat, and odors that we can barely imagine. Pest management. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were constant companions for medieval people. These pests thrived in the warm, unwashed environments of medieval homes and clothing. Even the wealthy couldn't completely escape infestation. Women developed various strategies for managing pests. They might place aromatic herbs in clothing chests to repel insects. Some used combs designed specifically for removing lice from hair. The wealthy might employ servants whose primary job was picking fleas and lice from their master's clothing. The famous flea-fur wedding gift mentioned in medieval records was a fur wrap designed to attract fleas away from the wearer's body. The idea was that fleas would prefer the fur to human skin, providing some relief from bites and irritation. Despite these efforts, pest-borne diseases were common. The bubonic plague, spread by fleas from infected rats, killed millions throughout the medieval period. Women, who were responsible for managing households and caring for the sick, were often on the front lines of these epidemics. While most medieval women were denied formal education, a tiny minority managed to pursue intellectual development that rivaled or exceeded that of their male contemporaries. Their achievements highlight the vast potential that was systematically suppressed in the vast majority of medieval women. The rare gift of literacy. Literacy rates among medieval women were catastrophically low. Even among the nobility, perhaps 5% of women could read, and fewer still could write with any skill. For peasant women, literacy was virtually unknown, a luxury they couldn't afford and didn't need for their prescribed roles. The few women who did learn to read typically received instruction for specific purposes. They might learn enough to read devotional texts or manage household accounts. Some noble daughters were taught to read so they could correspond with family members or potential marriage partners. But learning to write was even rarer than learning to read. Writing required expensive materials, parchment, ink, quills, and considerable practice to develop legible script. Most women who could read couldn't write beyond their own names. This educational deprivation wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate strategy for maintaining male control. Literate women might read subversive ideas, correspond with people outside their family's control, or develop intellectual ambitions inappropriate to their gender. Christine de Pizan's revolutionary achievement. Christine de Pizan's success as a professional writer was so unusual that it's difficult to overstate its significance. When she began supporting her family through her pen, she was venturing into territory that was almost exclusively male. Medieval authorship carried significant authority and influence. Writers shaped public opinion, preserved cultural knowledge, and influenced political decisions. By claiming this role for herself, Christine was implicitly arguing that women deserved intellectual respect and cultural influence. Her early works were carefully crafted to avoid challenging gender norms too directly. Love ballads and religious poetry were acceptable feminine genres that allowed her to establish her reputation without provoking too much resistance. But as her confidence grew, Christine became increasingly bold in challenging misogynistic attitudes. Her Letter to the God of Love defended women against accusations of fickleness and moral weakness. Her City of Ladies went further, systematically dismantling arguments for female inferiority. Christine's method was brilliant in its subtlety. Rather than directly attacking male authority, she simply presented evidence of women's capabilities throughout history. She told stories of female scholars, warriors, inventors, and leaders who had achieved greatness when given opportunities. The convent as center of learning. For women seeking intellectual development, convents provided the only realistic pathway. Within monastery walls, removed from the pressures of marriage and motherhood, some women could pursue learning that would have been impossible in secular life. Learned nuns became renowned scholars whose expertise was sought by male intellectuals. They mastered Latin, studied theology and philosophy, and contributed to theological debates. Some nuns wrote extensive commentaries on biblical texts or developed new approaches to spiritual practice. The scriptorium work that nuns performed required high levels of literacy and artistic skill. Copying manuscripts demanded perfect penmanship, while illuminating texts required artistic talent and knowledge of complex symbolic systems. Some convents became centers of scientific learning. Nuns studied medicine, botany, and astronomy. They maintained herb gardens where they experimented with plant-based remedies. Their medical knowledge often surpassed that of male physicians, though they couldn't practice publicly. Medieval women's experiences varied significantly depending on where they lived. Geography, climate, and local customs created different opportunities and constraints across medieval Europe. Urban versus rural experiences. Women in medieval cities often had more economic opportunities, but faced different dangers than their rural counterparts. Urban women could engage in trade, work in textile production, or operate small businesses like bakeries or alehouses. Cities also provided more anonymity. A woman fleeing an abusive marriage might disappear into urban crowds in ways that would be impossible in small villages where everyone knew everyone else's business. However, urban life brought its own hazards. Cities were crowded, unsanitary, and disease-ridden. Crime was common, and women were vulnerable to assault and exploitation. The concentration of wealth in cities also created sharper contrasts between rich and poor. Rural women lived in closer connection to natural cycles but had fewer economic options. Agricultural communities provided more social support, neighbors were more likely to intervene in cases of extreme abuse, but they also offered less privacy and more social control. Regional variations. Different regions of Europe developed different customs regarding women's rights and roles. In some parts of Italy and southern France, women retained more property rights after marriage. In Scandinavian countries, women sometimes participated more actively in trade and agriculture. The influence of Germanic law codes in some regions provided women with more legal protections than Roman law traditions. In areas where Viking culture had strong influence, women sometimes enjoyed greater freedom of movement and economic participation. However, these regional variations were matters of degree rather than fundamental difference. Nowhere in medieval Europe did women enjoy anything approaching equality with men, and the basic patterns of subordination were remarkably consistent across different cultures and regions. Climate and seasonal challenges. The harsh European climate presented particular challenges for medieval women. Long, cold winters meant months of indoor confinement in poorly heated homes. Women were responsible for preserving enough food to sustain their families through months when fresh provisions were unavailable. Summer brought different challenges: intensive agricultural work, food preservation during harvest season, and preparation for the coming winter. Women worked frantically during good weather to accumulate supplies that would carry their families through harsh months ahead. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, early frosts could destroy a year's worth of preparation and leave families facing starvation. Women bore the primary responsibility for managing these crises, stretching inadequate supplies, and finding creative solutions to food shortages. For the minority of medieval women who survived the dangers of childhood, frequent pregnancy, disease, and accident to reach old age, their final years often brought new forms of vulnerability and marginalization. The precarious position of widows. Widowhood could bring either liberation or disaster, depending on a woman's circumstances. Wealthy widows might finally gain some control over property and decision-making, but poor widows often faced destitution and social ostracism. A widow's legal position was complex and varied by region and social class. She might inherit her husband's property, but only for her lifetime, with ultimate ownership passing to male heirs. She could usually remain in the family home but might lose this right if she remarried or was deemed to be managing the property poorly. For peasant widows, survival often meant dependence on grown children or community charity. Without a husband's labor and income, an elderly woman might find herself unable to maintain a household or support herself. Moving in with reluctant relatives was common but often led to conflict and resentment. Some widows found economic independence through their late husband's trades. A baker's widow might continue operating the bakery. A merchant's widow might maintain commercial relationships. But this required considerable skill and often faced resistance from male-dominated guilds and authorities. The wisdom and vulnerability of age. Elderly women occupied a paradoxical position in medieval society. On one hand, their experience and knowledge made them valuable resources for their communities. They served as repositories of medical knowledge, cultural traditions, and practical skills accumulated over decades. Older women often served as midwives, having learned through their own birthing experiences and years of attending other women. Their knowledge of herbal remedies and folk medicine made them important community resources, especially in rural areas where formal medical care was unavailable. But this same knowledge that made elderly women valuable also made them vulnerable to witchcraft accusations. A wise woman who could heal might just as easily be accused of causing illness through malevolent magic. Her independence and outspokenness, perhaps developed after years of subordination, could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural evil. The economics of aging. Medieval society had no social safety net for elderly people. Families were expected to care for aging relatives, but this often created financial strain that led to neglect or abuse. An elderly woman who couldn't contribute to household work might be seen as a burden rather than a respected elder. Some elderly women found refuge in religious institutions. Convents sometimes accepted older women as lay sisters or servants. While this provided basic shelter and food, it also meant spending final years in servitude to younger, more privileged nuns. The few elderly women who maintained independence often did so through small-scale economic activities. They might brew ale, tend herb gardens, or provide childcare for working mothers. These activities provided survival income while allowing them to maintain some dignity and autonomy. Let's follow a composite medieval woman through the seasons of her life, understanding how the constraints and possibilities of womanhood evolved from birth to death. Spring, childhood, and preparation. Our medieval girl begins life in spring, not because of when she was born, but because childhood represents the spring of life, full of potential that will largely go unrealized. From ages 3 to 12, she learns the skills that will define her adult existence. She watches her mother manage the household, absorbing lessons about cooking, cleaning, and childcare through observation and gradually increasing participation. By age 7, she can spin thread, tend smaller children, and help with simple cooking tasks. Her education in womanhood is comprehensive but narrow. She learns to read men's moods, to make herself small when necessary, to find satisfaction in serving others' needs. She practices the virtues that will determine her survival: obedience, modesty, diligence, and silence. Religious instruction reinforces these lessons. She learns about Eve's weakness and Mary's perfection, understanding that these represent the poles of female possibility: sinful temptation or virtuous submission. Summer, marriage and motherhood. Summer represents the productive years of marriage and childbearing, typically from ages 15 to 45. This is when a medieval woman's life was most constrained, but also when she wielded whatever limited power her society allowed. As a new bride, she must quickly establish her place in her husband's household while learning to manage domestic responsibilities. The early years of marriage are a test of her ability to adapt and survive in new circumstances. Pregnancy and childbirth dominate these decades. Our composite woman might endure 8 to 12 pregnancies, with perhaps half resulting in children who survive infancy. Each pregnancy is a gamble with death, each birth a testament to her courage and endurance. Between pregnancies, she manages an increasingly complex household as children grow and family needs expand. She becomes the family's primary caregiver, nurse, and domestic manager, while also contributing to economic production through textile work, food processing, or agricultural labor. Autumn, maturity and experience. If our woman survives the dangers of frequent childbearing, her autumn years might bring some measure of increased respect and authority. Her children are grown, her childbearing years are over, and her accumulated experience make her valuable to her community. She might serve as a midwife, drawing on her own birthing experiences to help other women. Her knowledge of herbal remedies and folk medicine could provide essential health care in communities without physicians. Within her household, she might finally have some authority over daughters-in-law and grandchildren. After decades of subordination, she could exercise the limited power that came with being the senior woman in an extended family. However, these years also bring new vulnerabilities. Her husband might take a younger wife if she can no longer bear children. Her adult children might resent supporting an aging parent. Her outspokenness, tolerated in youth, might now be interpreted as evidence of supernatural evil. Winter, old age, and death. The winter of a medieval woman's life was often harsh and lonely. If she survived to true old age, past 60, she faced a society that had little use for elderly women. Widowhood was common in these years, leaving women economically vulnerable and socially isolated. Without husbands or young children to care for, elderly women occupied an ambiguous position in society. Some found meaning in religious devotion, spending their final years in prayer and preparation for death. Others maintained usefulness through specialized knowledge, serving as community-wise women or maintaining cultural traditions through storytelling. But many simply endured, dependent on reluctant relatives or community charity, waiting for death to release them from lives that had been defined by constraint and struggle from beginning to end. Throughout our journey, we focused primarily on women who fit recognizable social categories: wives, mothers, nuns, queens. But medieval society also included women who lived on the margins: prostitutes, criminals, heretics, and others who existed outside conventional social structures. Women of the streets. Prostitution was simultaneously condemned and tolerated in medieval society. Cities recognized that large populations of unmarried men, soldiers, merchants, students, clerics, created demand for sexual services that couldn't be completely suppressed. Many cities established official red light districts where prostitution was regulated and taxed. In London, the Southwark Stews were licensed brothels that operated under royal authority. Women who worked in these establishments had some legal protections but faced constant moral condemnation. The women who entered prostitution came from various backgrounds. Some were widows or unmarried women who couldn't support themselves through other means. Others were domestic servants who had been sexually exploited by their employers and found themselves unemployable in respectable households. Life as a prostitute was dangerous and often brief. Violence from customers was common, and disease was rampant. Many women turned to alcohol to cope with their circumstances, creating additional health problems. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, women found ways to support each other. Prostitutes formed informal networks for protection and mutual aid. Older women might mentor younger ones, teaching them survival strategies and looking out for their safety. Female criminals and outcasts. Women who turned to crime faced brutal treatment from medieval justice systems. Female thieves, con artists, and vagabonds were punished with exceptional severity, as if their gender made their crimes particularly heinous. Punishments for female criminals were often designed to be sexually humiliating. Women might be stripped and whipped in public, branded on their faces or hands, or subjected to ducking, being tied to a chair and repeatedly. The stocks and pillory were common punishments that exposed women to public abuse and humiliation. Crowds would throw rotten food, human waste, and stones at the immobilized victims. Some women died from exposure or injuries sustained during these public punishments. Female criminals were also more likely to be accused of witchcraft in addition to their other crimes. A woman who stole food might be accused of using magic to bewitch her victims. This double jeopardy meant that female criminals faced both secular punishment and potential execution for supernatural crimes. Women outside the system. Some medieval women existed completely outside conventional social structures. Female hermits lived in forests or remote areas, surviving through begging, gathering, or performing odd jobs for rural communities. These women had achieved a kind of freedom through complete social rejection. Without families, homes, or social positions to maintain, they could move freely and live according to their own choices. But this freedom came at the cost of security, comfort, and social connection. Traveling women, pilgrims, entertainers, merchants also existed in a liminal space between conventional society and complete marginalization. They might have more freedom of movement than settled women, but they were also more vulnerable to violence and exploitation. Some women joined bands of criminals or vagabonds, living rough but independent lives. These female outlaws robbed travelers, participated in smuggling operations, or survived through various forms of fraud and theft. As we near the end of our journey through medieval women's lives, it's important to consider how the attitudes and institutions we've explored continued to influence women's experiences for centuries afterward. Legal and social legacies. Many of the legal principles that subordinated medieval women persisted well into the modern era. The doctrine of coverture, which made married women legally invisible, wasn't fully abolished in most Western countries until the late 19th or 20th centuries. The idea that women were naturally suited only for domestic roles continued to limit educational and professional opportunities for centuries. Medical theories about female intellectual inferiority provided scientific justification for discrimination long after medieval theology lost its explanatory power. The association of female independence with moral danger persisted in various forms. Women who lived alone, pursued careers, or challenged conventional gender roles continued to face social condemnation and practical obstacles rooted in medieval assumptions about proper feminine behavior. Economic patterns. The medieval economy's dependence on unpaid female labor established patterns that continue today. Women's domestic work, cooking, cleaning, childcare, elder care, remained largely invisible and uncompensated, even as societies became more prosperous and egalitarian. The concentration of women in certain economic sectors, textiles, food service, caregiving, created occupational segregation that persisted for centuries. Even when women gained access to other fields, these traditionally female occupations remained undervalued and underpaid. The assumption that women's economic contributions were secondary to men's primary breadwinning role influenced everything from educational policies to social welfare systems. Women were treated consistently as dependents rather than economic actors in their own right. The imagery that portrayed women as either pure saints or dangerous temptresses continued to shape cultural representations of femininity long after the medieval period ended. The Madonna-whore dichotomy became deeply embedded in Western culture, limiting women's ability to be seen as complex, complete human beings. The fear of female sexuality that drove medieval witch hunts evolved into other forms of control and surveillance. Women's sexual behavior continued to be policed more strictly than men's, with women bearing primary responsibility for sexual morality and family honor. The idealization of female suffering and sacrifice, exemplified by medieval saints who achieved holiness through pain, created cultural expectations that women should find fulfillment through self-denial and service to others. As our 3-hour journey through medieval women's lives draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on what these historical experiences teach us about both how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Progress made. The differences between medieval and modern women's lives are staggering. Today, women in most developed countries enjoy legal equality, educational opportunities, reproductive choices, and professional possibilities that would have been unimaginable to their medieval ancestors. Women today can vote, own property, pursue careers, choose whether and when to marry, control their fertility, and seek legal protection from abuse. These freedoms, which we sometimes take for granted, represent centuries of struggle by women who refused to accept the limitations imposed upon them. The medieval ideal of female silence has been thoroughly rejected. Women today are encouraged to speak up, express opinions, and claim authority in areas from politics to science to literature. The very act of women telling their own stories, rather than having their experiences filtered through male perspectives, represents a revolutionary change. Persistent challenges. Yet, many of the fundamental challenges that medieval women faced persist in modified forms today. Violence against women remains a global epidemic. In many societies, women still lack basic rights to education, property ownership, and reproductive choice. The economic patterns established in medieval times, women's concentration in lower-paid occupations, the undervaluation of care work, the assumption that women are secondary earners, continue to create financial inequality and dependence. Cultural attitudes about female sexuality, ambition, and authority still echo medieval assumptions. Women who seek power or recognition continue to face questioning and criticism that men in similar positions don't encounter. The witch hunt mentality, the impulse to blame and punish women who step outside conventional roles, manifests in contemporary forms of harassment and character assassination directed at women who challenge established hierarchies. The continuing struggle. Perhaps most importantly, our exploration of medieval women's lives reminds us that progress isn't inevitable or permanent. The freedoms that women enjoy today were hard-won through centuries of struggle, and they can be lost if we become complacent about defending them. The resilience and resistance that medieval women showed in their constrained circumstances provide inspiration for contemporary women facing different but related challenges. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, human dignity and agency find ways to assert themselves. As we conclude our extended meditation on medieval women's lives, let's return to the individuals whose stories have guided our journey. Remembering Isabel of Bavaria. Think again of teenage Isabel, torn from her family to marry a mad king in a foreign land. Despite her youth and the impossible circumstances thrust upon her, Isabel found ways to influence French politics and protect her children. When Charles VI was incapacitated by madness, she served as regent, wielding authority normally reserved for men. Isabel's story reminds us that even women who seemed to conform to medieval expectations often found ways to exercise agency within their constraints. Her political acumen and survival instincts enabled her to navigate one of the most turbulent periods in French history. Honoring Christine de Pizan. Christine de Pizan's courage in supporting herself through writing opened doors for countless women who came after her. Her willingness to challenge misogynistic assumptions planted seeds of feminist thought that would bloom centuries later. More than her specific arguments, Christine's very existence as a professional female author proved that women could excel in intellectual pursuits when given opportunities. Her success provided a template for other women seeking to claim authority through their minds rather than their bodies. Recognizing everyday heroism. But perhaps most importantly, we must honor the countless unnamed women whose stories haven't survived in historical records. The peasant women who kept their families fed through famines. The mothers who lost child after child but kept nurturing the survivors. The widows who found ways to support themselves and their children against impossible odds. These women may not have changed the course of history in obvious ways, but they preserved life, culture, and hope through the darkest periods of human experience. Their daily acts of courage, getting up each morning to face another day of hardship, finding ways to create beauty and meaning within severe constraints, passing on knowledge and love to the next generation. These were heroic achievements in their own right. The thread of continuity. Medieval women's lives were threads in a vast tapestry of human experience that connects directly to our own time. The woman struggling to balance work and family today inherits both the constraints and the resilience of her medieval ancestors. The ongoing fight for reproductive rights echoes medieval women's desperate attempts to control their own fertility. Contemporary debates about women's roles in religion, politics, and public life continue conversations that began in medieval convents and castle chambers. The networks of female support that sustain women today, from formal organizations to informal friendships, evolved from the survival strategies that medieval women developed to help each other through impossible circumstances.